Howdy folks, this is Big Sam. Today I'm going to be showing you about a secret date that you probably didn't know about on your Mosin. Now, as most people know, Mosin Nagants will almost always have a date of manufacture up here on the barrel. However, they also have another secret date hidden on the receiver. Now, before I show you that, I want to help distinguish the barrel and the receiver. So I'm going to put my finger here for reference. To the left of my finger is the barrel. To the right of my finger is the receiver. So here's the barrel, and it actually screws into the receiver, which is this whole back piece. So here's a barrel for reference, okay? So you can see it actually screws into the receiver, like that. Very simple. Okay, now there's a date on the bottom of the receiver, and I'm going to show you that now. So I'm going to go ahead and disassemble this rifle, and I'll fast forward through this step, but just for reference, it's really simple to disassemble one of these guys. This particular rifle is a 9130. All you have to do is remove the two barrel bands. They just slide all the way off. And then you just remove your two action screws up here and down here, and then you can pull the gun out of the stock. So I'm going to do that now. All right, so here we are now. We've got our disassembled rifle. And before we take a closer look at this, I want to stress that this is a 9130 rifle. So this is going to be the most common Mosin Nagant most people will see. They made millions and millions and millions of these, especially during World War II. But this is going to get a little interesting. Now, before we look at the date, I want you to guess what year this gun was made. If it's a 9130, so maybe, what are we going to say, 1934? 1928? We can see here that's a hex receiver. So we know that the newest it could be is right around 1936. So it's probably older than that. All right, you got your guess in? Cool. So what we're going to do is we're going to flip it over to look at the bottom of it here. So here's your receiver. And then you go to the very back. All right, see that? This gun was actually manufactured in 1895, so way before World War II. And we can see here there's that little bow and arrow, so we know that this was made by the Ijevsk company. All right, and then that little thing that looks like an R, that's a Cyrillic character. It stands for Goda, which is Russian for year. So the year 1895, produced by the Ijevsk arsenal. Really interesting gun. So this is actually a really interesting date based off of gun laws here in the United States, because any firearm manufactured before 1899 is considered an antique. So the federal government doesn't consider this gun right here to be a firearm at all in America. Now, there are some states that have different laws. So while the federal government says this gun is an antique, there may be certain states like Illinois, for example, which is kind of made famous by all of the Chicago gun control craziness. But in Illinois, they actually say that this is a firearm because it still shoots a modern cartridge. So if you're in America, definitely look up and make sure you know your local and state laws. But from a federal standpoint, this rifle is considered an antique. So also that's cool because maybe some of y'all have seen the television show called Pawn Stars. It's about a pawn shop in Las Vegas that buys all sorts of neat stuff. Well, they tend to buy a lot of really old guns. If you look them up on YouTube, you'll see they buy lots of strange old guns. They do not have what's called a federal firearms license. So basically what that means is if you have a federal firearms license in America, you can legally sell modern firearms. So firearms made 1899 and newer, but they do not, so they can only buy firearms made before 1899. So maybe one day we'll see a Mosin walk into their shop. You never know. So if any of y'all watching have a Mosin Nagant that has a hex receiver, I urge you to take it out of the stock and check the date under here. This is called the tang, the receiver tang. So check the date under the receiver tang, because if you have an antique, that makes it really cool and a lot more interesting than an already interesting rifle that it is. So that's really cool. And it's interesting because, again, this is a 9130. So even if yours is a 9130, if it has a hex receiver, and remember, it has to have a hex receiver because if it has the round receiver, it cannot be an antique. So it has to at least have a hex receiver for it to even possibly be an antique made before 1899 here in the United States. And one of the reasons some of these guns exist, now if we look at the date here, you'll actually see that the barrel date matches as well, 1895. What's interesting, though, is it doesn't always match. A lot of times you'll have Mosin Nagants where the barrel could say, 1941, but the receiver is actually an antique. Well, why is that? Well, one of the reasons is the gun could have come from Finland. Finland did this a lot of times where they have an old receiver that's still good, but the barrel is useless. It's shot out, and it's just not very accurate anymore. So they'll actually replace the barrel on that old receiver with a new one. You'll see that happen quite a lot. Another interesting potential reason, though, from the Russian side, and this is not a gun from Finland, this is from Russia. Some guns you could see with a 1941 barrel date and an antique receiver. And that's because after Operation Barbarossa started in June of 1941, that was when the Nazis invaded the motherland, the Izhevsk arsenal actually discovered that in their basement, they had 60,000 old receivers from the imperial era. Now, there's a lot of speculation as to why that was. We'll get into that one another day. But a lot of those could theoretically have been antiques. And so what they ended up doing was, instead of having to, make more receivers, which of course they did, they had to ramp up production. In addition to that, though, they took those 60,000 receivers and they actually used them and built new guns off of them. So you can see, it's actually, I wouldn't say it's common, but you can still see some if you look hard enough. Ones with a 1941 barrel date and a hex receiver. Okay, anytime you have a gun, made after 1936 with a hex receiver, it's interesting. And again, that's not the only time you'll see that happen, but that was just one example where, they found tens of thousands of these receivers. I believe it was 60,000. And, they made new guns out of them, which is really cool. And this is just one of the reasons the Mosin Nagant is such a fascinating rifle. There's so much history and so much variation here that every single gun is different and has its own unique story to tell. And that's why we appreciate them so much here on this channel. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope you learned something neat from this video. Again, if you have a Mosin with a hex receiver, I urge you to remove the stock and see what your receiver date is, because it may surprise you. Let me know what y'all would like to see next, and let me know if y'all have any prayer requests. Thanks for watching, guys.